You can see some of the commentariat shifting. Even like Charlie Kirk has sort of moved away from sort of a hardline pro-Israel position.
You said that you couldn't find anyone under the age of 40 within your circle that remains pro-Israel.
I think the heart of the MAGA movement is populism, and YouTube is overwhelmingly dominated by younger viewers than Fox News. I was raised with very, very strongly pro-Zionist views. At one point, I was enthusiastic about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and tried to join the military when I was relatively young. What I discovered was the government of Israel defined the start of the war, and they say, well, blockades are inherently acts of war. Well, they've been blockading Gaza for years.
Who would have thought, even 2 years ago, that those on the American right would question US commitments to Israel and Zionism? But that is exactly what's happening in Republican heartlands. I met James Bell, a Texas-based Catholic campaigner, Trump supporter, and until recently, someone who would reliably support America's forever wars.
The U.S. needs to use its authority to be a voice for people who are being oppressed and persecuted, and now the U.S. is doing its worse than nothing because we're giving the bombs to the Israeli government.
I think Gaza has been a wake-up call.
We need to abandon these forever wars in the Middle East.
I'm here in Ottawa, Canada, after my trip to Dallas. This interview with James Bell was filmed before the murder of Charlie Kirk, but much of what is talked about addresses the schism that now exists within the MAGA movement. How can this movement, one that believes that America has engaged in useless forever wars and should not try to reconstruct the world in its own image, how can such a movement accept the primacy of Israel to American foreign policy, with all the moral and intellectual failures that come with supporting genocide? Charlie Kirk was beginning to question these sacred cows, even though his perspective remained deeply immoral and problematic. But for Muslims, the MAGA movement, if shaped by moral and less chauvinistic ideas, would help a Muslim world that doesn't rely on mass migration and remittances, that can foster its own cultural and religious identity, and most importantly, can be free of authoritarians who have long served a globalist US agenda and that of Zionism.
James Bell, it's really wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us today on The Thinking Muslim.
It's my pleasure.
James, I've really, yesterday we met and we had a fantastic conversation, and I really want to understand someone like you, actually. I'm an outsider to this country, of course, and I've been studying from afar the trends within the Republican movement, the MAGA trend in particular, and I think, and the religious right in America. And I think you, in a sense, from my conversation with you yesterday, you represent all of that. So I want to understand the MAGA movement today. But I was struck by something you said to me yesterday, which I found really interesting. You said that you couldn't find anyone under the age of 40 within your circle that remains pro-Israel. I mean, that's extraordinary to me. Can you explain that shift? Like, what accounts for that shift, please?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of contributing factors. One of the things is, I myself have some disagreements with some of the people in my family. I was raised definitely with sort of the standard, very, very strongly pro-Zionist views that I was kind of brought up with. Mm-hmm. And for me, it had been kind of a gradual process.
Yeah.
Generation Z, so I'm a millennial, and so I'm 40 years old. And Generation Z, I would say the conservatives have basically no pro-Zionist sentiment that I've ever been aware of among any of the Generation Z conservatives that I've ever met. Now, that could be reflective of the fact that the circles that I go with could be, I have a very unrepresentative sample, but I doubt it. Mm. I think that there's a lot of dynamics that are at play in Western and American politics, particularly, that are leading towards a shift in assessment on the U.S.'s level of commitment to following whatever the state of Israel policy happens to be at a particular point in time.
Yeah.
And that shift is accelerating with young people for sure on the right. There's been, in the commentariat world, for example, Tucker Carlson has been giving more and more voice to that sort of view.
Yeah.
And it's important to recognize the dynamics at play there. YouTube, which is where I think the majority of the consumption of his videos and media comes in, is overwhelmingly dominated by younger viewers than Fox News, his previous place. And so there's a degree to which I think he's very sensitive to the desires of his audience.
Mm-hmm.
And his audience is a young audience, and they're definitely questioning the orthodoxy of sort of the strong Zionist sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
The contributing factors to me fall into a number of categories. One of the categories that is a big contributing factor in my view is young people for the first time are often graduating from college with massive student loans.
Right.
And that affects the left and the right in both cases. But there's sort of a general anger at sort of the question of usury, which isn't really well understood among general in the people in the West. I myself fall into St. Thomas Aquinas's view of the question of usury. He has some disagreements with Averroes, who a lot of Muslims have read. I've read some excerpts from him.
Mm-hmm.
And Maimonides has his own views. They each actually commented on Aristotle's anti-usury views in the 13th century with various degrees of consent. But the sort of anti-usury view makes people feel sort of estranged from the establishment. They're like, hey, I graduate from college. I've got, I have many younger clients that, husband and wife, they've got $120,000 in student loan debt. Significant interest payments and not a real key way out. And it's almost, a lot of them feel almost like alienated, almost like a form of slavery. And that sort of makes them very anti-establishment. Right. And so the degree to which the Zionist, message has been something that's been very, very integral to the establishment foreign policy message, that very degree makes it less palatable to these young people. That I think is a big contributing factor.
Assalamu alaikum. I need your help. Our videos are currently being suppressed on this platform, which means they're not appearing as frequently as they used to. In fact, over the past 2 months, there's been a significant drop in impressions. Now, experts tell us this is due to a proactive decision. To resolve this, I need you all to subscribe to this channel. Over 60% of our regular viewers are still not subscribers. And crucially, please click on the bell notification so you don't miss any future episodes. My commitment to you is that I will continue to provide free, thought-provoking content, but I need you to spread the word, comment, and keep an eye out for our shows. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I've seen that this shift has been somewhat gradual, and historically, go back 10, 20 years, there was a plurality, a strong opinion on the right in particular, a strong pro-Zionist opinion on the right. And I just wonder whether these last 20 years of the war on terror, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the never-ending wars in the Middle East, how much of this sort of anti-Zionist or anti-Israel feeling has come down to those conflicts over the past 20, 25 years?
Well, I can talk for example about my own life. So I was very pro-Afghanistan war and pro-Iraq war when they first happened. A lot of the propaganda that the U.S. put out around that time I found very persuasive. I was very well versed in the sins of Uday and Hussein, Saddam Hussein's sons, and how they abused sort of the power and privilege of the Iraqi government and things like that. And I was very sort of persuaded sort of like a do-gooder. Hey, there's something, obviously Saddam Hussein was not a very lovable person, and so he was easy for me to to think, okay, this is someone who's bad. This is someone who we need to take action against. But at the same time, since then, it's been hard to ignore the fact that there's been more and more problems associated with this. Just to give a couple of foreign policy examples that really struck me was the United States had invested, obviously, at one point, a lot of money into the Saddam Hussein regime as part of their sponsoring of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. And so a lot of the weapons that Saddam Hussein's military had were actually U.S. weapons to begin with, back from the 80s. Then once we went anti-Saddam, and we also, Saddam, of course, was a Ba'athist, which is a particular socialist wing of Muslim thought. And so also in Syria was
Assad,
Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah.
And so the U.S. was also funding anti-Assad movements at the same time.
Yeah.
And the whole rise of the Islamic State, which is interesting, was basically Syria and Iraq share a very large border that doesn't have a big, beautiful wall, as Trump would put it, in between them. And so there was weapons going in, American weapons going into sort of anti-Assad forces on the Syria side of the border, and they were showing up in Iraq. Christians were being killed. There was kind of like a more radical wing of it, and it just looked like, wow, this is what the U.S. has done to Iraq. It's obviously, the proof was sort of in the pudding. I was persuaded of the righteousness of the Iraq War for several years, and I even, at one point, I was enthusiastic about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and tried to join the military when I was relatively young. I ended up contracting type 1 diabetes when I tried to join the military, so that ended that endeavor very rapidly before it got started. But I personally was persuaded by the evidence, and I think a lot of Americans went through that process. It's interesting because as recently as the 2008 presidential Republican primary elections, there was people like Ron Paul would go out and say, hey, this is terrible. We need to abandon these forever wars in the Middle East. And he would always get booed by all the Republican crowds. And just 8 years later, in 2016, when Trump was saying it, which of course was after the whole issue with the anti-Assad and the Islamic State and all these different things, then Trump was saying it, and he was actually getting, in some cases, cheered. And so that shift in the Republican Party, I think, was evidence-driven.
Right. And how much does religion contribute to the way you see the state of Israel, the way you see what's happening at the moment? And we would very much call it a genocide. Is there a theological element to how you view what is taking place? I know Catholic religious tradition pays a lot of emphasis to the dignity of the oppressed. Does that feature in the conversations you're having with your peers about what is taking place at the moment, the asymmetry of this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians?
Yes. I think the Catholic emphasis on standing up for the downtrodden is definitely a motivating factor for me. But I'm very much within the natural law tradition. And so I view the natural law as something that you can access with your reason without necessarily having to be Catholic. And a lot of Catholic social teaching is based on natural law arguments that should reach across denomination or religious boundaries. And so I don't find it necessary to be Catholic to be persuaded of this. But one of the things in particular that has troubled me about what I learned growing up as a kid in particular versus what's going on now is the Six-Day War. And the Six-Day War to me is very relevant, in 1967, because the Six-Day War I had always been taught was something that the states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria had started a war against Israel.
Yeah.
And when I did a little bit more research, what I discovered was the government of Israel defined the start of the war as Mohammed Nasser, who was then president of Egypt. He had blocked the Straits of Tiras, which is a port. It's an avenue for Israeli merchant shipping to go into the Indian Ocean. And when he closed the port of Tiras, the Israeli government and military define that as a blockade, and they say, well, blockades are inherently acts of war. And so they define Mohammed Nasser as having started that war. Well, they've been blockading Gaza for years. And so if they define blockades as acts of war, then I mean, their blockade was more intense than the closing of the Straits of Tiras. They still had the Mediterranean ports, Jaffa and all the rest.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not convenient to go all the way around the Horn of Africa from Jaffa. And so there was obviously a lot of bite to what Mohammed Nasser was trying to do. I don't want to necessarily condone his actions necessarily, but the conquest itself was based on a rationale that the Israeli government seems hypocritical in not acknowledging in the same way.
So, James, do you think Gaza, Palestine, could become for the right what Vietnam was for the left, a kind of moral reckoning that reshapes political opinion here in America?
I think for the right, a big aspect for the right is the idea that Trump always advocates, which is this whole America First principle. And I think that it might be more correct to say that it is one piece in a larger tapestry of the U.S. reevaluating its commitment to some of these forever wars and Ukraine also and other wars the right is increasingly skeptical of. And it's interesting, you can see some of the commentariat shifting pretty dramatically, especially among those who are on YouTube with younger audiences. Even like Charlie Kirk has sort of moved away from sort of a hardline pro-Israel position, and other conservative commentators are kind of responding to the shifting appetites of U.S. conservatives. But one thing that I think is, this is a classic conservative analysis of politics, but one thing that I think has been a big contributor to alienation among the right is that a lot of young people don't have present fathers in the picture. And that dynamic has been a big driver of alienation from the establishment. And increasingly in the world of social media, people look towards online personalities to sort of be a father figure. I think that this phenomenon has been accelerating in the U.S. for a while. Fatherlessness has been gradually declining, or increasing, I should say, in the U.S. for quite a little while now.
I mean, I thought that was a phenomenon within left-leaning communities.
I agree. I think there was a degree to which the Barack Obama campaign in 2008 was sort of creating his image to such an extent that it would appeal to people sort of looking for a dad, and there's an element of Barack Obama. But now it's interesting, like with the Gen Z and the younger people, it's surprising how many people, for example, are talking about, well, what's Andrew Tate been saying recently, and so there's a lot of sort of edgy figures. One of the things that I think creates a lot of sympathy among the right for what's going on in Gaza and other areas. The West Bank also has a lot of really bad stuff going on too, with the settler movement. Is we are very, very used to censorship because the elite establishments, Harvard University and all the most prestigious universities, a lot of the mainstream media lean strongly left in the U.S. And so the right has always sort of felt like it needed alternative places to alternative ways to communicate, and dealt a lot with censorship. And this similar things are going on to a great extent with Gaza. People, I'm very anti-COVID lockdowns, for example. It's a fairly classic conservative viewpoint, but the lockdown thing, you couldn't get YouTube videos approved in 2020, 2021, advocating for certain views that were anti-lockdown in the COVID issue. And conservatives became acutely aware of how important it was for these social media giants to kind of control the levers of power. But now, from what I understand from my Muslim friends, I've made recently several Muslim friends in the last year or so, is that there's very similar levers of power being utilized to try to suppress images and videos of things that are going on in Gaza on YouTube and other social media platforms. And so I would say that the phrasing in your question is slightly left-coded, and the frustration around censorship and the establishment are more, the right has become more populist, and populism is going to end up favoring the people who are viewed as oppressed, whether that be people with unbelievable student loan debts, or even in obviously far worse situations like people, who are being unable to get adequate nutrition in Gaza, and who are being displaced from their homes in the West Bank, and churches are being blown up and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, many of my viewers would not be familiar with the philosophy of the MAGA movement, like what it stands for, they wouldn't maybe see MAGA through the eyes of the Trump administration, what the Trump administration is doing and does not do. I mean, explain that to me. Explain the MAGA movement, what it stands for, and whether Trump in a way represents MAGA in its truest form.
I think Donald Trump is a really important political figure because he was the first major primary party nominee who was running on a very, very strictly populist message.
Yes.
Now, you could argue, I guess, that perhaps Barack Obama was slightly more populist than Hillary Clinton, but generally his attitude towards the establishment was he could work with people. A lot of times he had access to people in Hollywood, to people in college campuses. He had a lot of allies among elite institutions and celebrities and things like that. Trump was really coming in as sort of more of a true populist. And my father wrote a book called Populism and Elitism, Politics in the Age of Equality, and that was published in the 1990s. And the way that he defines populism, which I think is extremely resonant today, is he defines populism as that set of beliefs associated with the view that people are better at managing their own affairs than elites are at managing their affairs for them. And he would view elitism as people's view that it's better for elites to manage the affairs of the populace in various ways versus having the populace manage their own affairs. Elitism and populism is a really interesting lens through which to view the MAGA movement. It's almost self-evident that if you're a populist, you're going to be less favorable towards, for example, COVID lockdowns, or you're going to be, less of the view that the U.S. needs to control all the regimes of the world and make sure that justice is being dispensed in sort of an American way globally. And you're gonna generally have sort of a view. Now, I don't want to oversimplify things, because there's a degree to which populism, it automatically comes with moral rhetoric. So it's interesting. One of the people that my dad writes about, because he was very apropos in the 90s at the time, is Ross Perot. Ross Perot was often described as a populist, and he was considered, okay, this is the first rise of sort of a populist. And there is a sense in which Ross Perot tried to portray a populist image. But whenever he was asked about any sort of policy issue, he would always say something like, well, you know what we need to do about Social Security? We need to get the smartest people who are actuaries and economists, and lock them up in a room and have them figure out what the issue is and solve it. That's what we do in business. And so he would always say stuff like that, which is very, very actually elitist, solution. So he rarely had actual populist solutions. Trump was the first one to sort of really present more of a populist message that was focused on a moral argument that the populace could understand, rather than, hey, I want to hire these elites to manage this. Dr. Fauci needs to decide which businesses are opened or closed. He's an expert, these sorts of things. That's, I think, the heart of the MAGA movement is populism. And there's a degree to which Trump has many elitist advisors, and he also has some populist advisors. And you can see who's getting his ear at any given moment. There was a point in time in the Gaza conflict where Trump had really come out and said, hey, this is going too far. I just saw images of these children, and they're being, they had their arms taken off and all these sorts of things, and we need to, Israel needs to stop its aggression. So he made some really strong statements, but then he'll sort of vacillate. And it's similarly, even on a very unrelated issue, but the COVID lockdowns, like at first he was like, oh, don't worry about it, just go about your affairs as usual. And then more and more he started yielding to, the desires of sort of Dr. Fauci and the elites and things like that. And so the right is very populist now. And anytime that you hear rhetoric about experts doing this, or, foreign policy experts solving that, or, bankers figuring out, the Federal Reserve how to solve, the debt crisis or things like that, the right automatically recoils at that. And that I think is kind of the heart of the MAGA movement now.
So the MAGA movement is everything elites are, everything that is the opposite to what the elites are recommending and prescribing for American society.
Not necessarily. The way that populism and elitism works is that it just so happens, statistically speaking, that the more of an elite that you are, the more your views are going to tend to be elitist.
Right.
So if you're a physician, you are going to be, on average, more likely to have aggressive empowerment of the medical establishment views than, say, a nurse or an EMT or someone further down the totem pole. And obviously, as a percentage of the population, elites make up a disproportionately large percentage of the U.S. population.
Yeah. As
economies become more specialized, there's elite engineers, there's elite physicians, there's elite attorneys, there's elite economists. There's so many different kinds of elites in America that there's a surprising number of elites, and they actually make up a very, very significant voting bloc in the U.S. And they tend to be elitist. But then you have people like Trump. No one could ever argue that Trump is not an elite. I mean, he's a billionaire. He's been very successful as all these commercial real estate deals and all that kind of stuff. But he is very popular. So I would say a minority of the elites tend to be populist, and a majority tend to be elitist. Among the populace sentiments is very much elite, populist. The populace with a CE is more populist with an ST. And one of the ways that that's very manifested is, now I'm involved in local politics a little bit, just as an activist, not in any political capacity, but just in the city where I happen to live and where we are actually conducting this interview, Irving, Texas. In 2010, the Republican party was doing its gerrymandering. Like basically, gerrymandering, as your British friends may or may not know, is basically a process under which you might try to carve out certain legislative districts in a way that will help the party who's controlling where the lines are retain a majority. So generally, New York is heavily gerrymandered towards Democrats, California towards Democrats, Texas is gerrymandered towards Republicans. As recently as 2010, the Irving was gerrymandered in such a way that the wealthier section of Irving, which is the north of Irving, was all put into a district that was designed to be Republican. And the south of Irving, which tends to be a little bit poorer, was gerrymandered into a section that was designed to be Democrat. Since the Trump realignment movement and the MAGA movement, even just here in Irving, a lot of the South, and especially Hispanics, have swung hard to the right. And as a result of that, the gerrymandering map looks totally different. Like it used to be the case that people would discuss when they were buying real estate in Irving, hey, if you want to get real estate that really appreciates, you want to buy in the Republican district. And if you want to buy a house that you're not sure if the home value will appreciate as rapidly, you can buy in the Democratic district if your budget doesn't allow you to do the other. And that was advice that was like sometimes provided to people, but now it would make no sense to make any economic decision based on the current gerrymander, because the shift has happened such that the most southern district in Irving, which is not as wealthy, is the most conservative now, and the northern district has swung very hard to the left, so it's much more liberal.
From the outside, as an outsider, we often associate, at least the mainstream media, presents the MAGA movement as very white, possibly even racialized in its undertones. The MAGA movement has a cultural supremacy to it, and would rather have Latinos and maybe others as well, recent migrants, repatriated to their countries. I mean, how true is it when we describe the MAGA movement that there are these what I would call distasteful elements to it?
I think it's easy to so there's different elements to every political coalition. There's no political coalition that can be described as a monolith. I would say in Texas, where we are now, the majority of Hispanics are actually quite conservative.
Right.
And so Hispanics...
And they're embraced by the MAGA movement? The MAGA movement see them as equals?
Well, there's different kinds of Hispanics. A lot of Hispanics. Oh, yes, I would say yes. But for the most part, but a lot of Hispanics in Texas, like for example, there's what's called the Rio Grande Valley, and that used to be considered the bluest of the blue sections of Texas, and it's right along the border of the Rio Grande, and right on the border of Mexico. And that section used to be hard blue. Well, all of those districts flipped to Trump actually in 2020, and then even more so in 2024.
Yeah.
And those shifts are strong among Hispanics in Texas and elsewhere. And I would say that the MAGA movement and the conservative movement and the Republican Party is becoming increasingly more Hispanic. Now, I will say, of course, there's a very strong view that that's sort of like a populist take on immigration, that is, hey, these employers, these chambers of commerce and things like that, are bringing in people from the third world to be their cheap labor, and they're trying to take advantage of the ordinary working class of America by underpaying these people in wages and sometimes paying them under the table. And so there's a large extent to which the recoil is not racial but actually populist. It's aimed at the business community in some cases. Yeah, so that's quite a different slant to it. I will add that, like I mentioned earlier, Andrew Tate, he's kind of an interesting character, and he recently apparently I don't follow him at all closely, but I hear about him second and third hand for the most part from people that are younger than me. But I guess he recently announced that he had converted to Islam, and he's a very bombastic character, and from what I have understood, which please don't take this to the bank because I haven't researched it deeply,
Sure.
but he made a lot of money by I guess getting
Illicit.
girls to advertise their services on one of these apps. What's it called? Some sexual app. And anyway, he was like, hey, I'll market you and we'll split the thing. And so he made a lot of money, sort of what some people derogatorily and I think fairly call digital pimping. And then he drives around in fancy cars, and he bought a house in Romania, and he gets a lot of eyeballs, and I don't know as much, but I think there are sort of people who are so upset about the level of political correctness and speech policing that goes on in the U.S. that they will embrace someone who's willing to go really far out there and say things that sound, I'm sure pretty sexist, because they're looking to kind of look for, they have an iconoclastic slate of mind. I think among young people, there is an element of that they're just like, they're going to, reject in general things. I will also say that among thought leaders in the MAGA movement, there, in my view, is two main camps. The one camp would be people. It's interesting. A lot of the I forget the name of all of these characters, but there was the guy who was involved in the Charlottesville rally. I forget Spencer, I think Richard Spencer, if I'm not mistaken. He's, as far as I know, sort of an atheist type character, and he considers himself sort of an expert on evolution. And that there are sort of sections of the right. I believe they're relatively small. I almost never run across people who are fully into that, but there are sections of the right that I think are so angry about censorship that they're willing to embrace kind of what we would look at as more of a 19th century, worldview. Like Charles Darwin had a cousin named Dalton, who invented the so-called science of eugenics, and so the basic claims that some of these sort of allegedly conservative people will make is, some races are more evolved than others. Of course, the white race is the most evolved, and I think that obviously there's incredible historical context missed, and in particular, I think the influence of religion on the cultures is dramatically underrepresented by these sorts of racialist thinkers. I don't think they represent a high percentage, but I think that probably someone like Spencer, who probably has a relatively small social media following, will probably create content that gets sort of regurgitated by someone like Tate and sort of fed back into the ecosystem a little bit. But I would say that a lot of populists are also, especially among the intellectual class, are more likely to reject the whole theory of evolution. And so I myself fall into that category. And so, with that worldview, this whole idea that, there's different races and they evolved at different periods, none of that makes sense. Like, I believe that we are all descended of Adam and Eve, and, we're all basically second, third, fourth, fifth, or 70th cousins, and so that kind of creates, that to me is the more truly populist view, and I think represents an increasing percentage of the MAGA movement.
From what you describe it seems like the MAGA movement is very much a leaderless movement. I mean, how integral is Donald Trump to this movement? I note that in the past maybe a couple of months there has been there have been cries of betrayal, maybe from the MAGA movement. Like what accounts for this disconnect now between the base and Donald Trump?
Well, I think his stance on Gaza and to some extent also on Ukraine has
Right.
been a huge thing because he really campaigned on a strong peace platform, and that the U.S. wouldn't be, supporting military adventurisms in of foreign nations, and the situation in Israel. I mean, the data is insane. Like, the popularity of Israel's actions in Gaza. I think the U.S. has over a 70% disapproval rating, and most Republicans. I know that the 30%, a strong percentage of the percentage that still supports the action, may be older conservatives who are more enmeshed in sort of that Zionist mentality, and also older Democrats too. There's people like Nancy Pelosi and the older wing of the Democratic Party. They I would just say older folks in general represent that sort of core base of support for that. But yeah, the MAGA movement, Trump is expending he's losing incredible political capital by doing this. I remember, the feeling that I had during the COVID lockdowns. And I just remember when Trump, first announced, 14 days to slow the spread. And I almost couldn't believe my eyes that Trump, the populist, was going to hand over the keys of the economy to a physician researcher. And I almost couldn't believe my eyeballs. And so I feel like I've kind of gone through this before with Trump, where I feel like he's not living up to the way that he campaigned and the way that we were expecting him to govern. But in this case, he certainly would not have done nearly as well in Michigan and many of the other important swing states that he won quite a number of Muslim votes in Michigan, promising to bring change to the U.S.'s essentially free pass policy towards Israel. And when push came to shove, he hasn't followed through on that.
So what would, in your mind, a MAGA foreign policy look like? And what would be the role of America's immense military superiority in a world where you had a leader who really lived up to MAGA, the expectations of his base?
I think a truly populist foreign policy. The Jesse Helms and Ronald Reagan in the 1970s got a plank into the Republican platform called morality in foreign policy, and that plank I don't think has been discussed, especially recently, by the Trump administration sufficiently. And it's a really important aspect of the way that we should approach things. But generally speaking, the U.S. needs to use its authority to be a voice for people who are being oppressed and persecuted. It was always shocking to me that the U.S. did so little to help the Christians in northern Iraq, and now the U.S. is doing it's worse than nothing because we're giving the bombs and some of the military weapons to the Israeli government in terms of the situation in Gaza. And although it's not the U.S. government that I don't think that funds some of the aggressive actions that have recently happened to churches and horrible things in the West Bank, that some of that is coming through American donations, and so there's big problems, and in many cases you would think that the U.S. would have a special sympathy with people who are being persecuted, especially I mean, certainly anyone who's being persecuted, Muslim or Christian, should be spoken up for. But you would especially think that the Trump administration should have more sympathy for the Christians who have been persecuted, because the thing about the Christians that are being persecuted is that the whole rationale for the war is that there's this Islamic extremism that needs to be snuffed out, and you need to execute everyone who's associated with Hamas and things like that. Well, how could that be the basis for bombing that church in Gaza that happened just a few weeks ago, or there was damage done to a church in the West Bank recently as well, and so the rationale for, obviously there's no question that radical, Muslim extremism is needs to be condemned and should be condemned by the civilized, Muslim world and things like that. But there's no here. It shows sort of a inauthenticity in the rhetoric of the Israeli government that some of these Christian groups have been attacked, because there's no plausible way in which they're Hamas or participating in Islamic extremism.
So then how impactful is this generational shift, do you think, to America's stance, America's unwavering support for Israel and for Zionism, come 10, 20 years' time?
I think that the Israeli government is afraid that the stance is somewhat weakening, and that stance is weakening is actually somewhat serving as motivation to being a little bit more aggressive. It's almost like they're concerned that they may have a shorter runway.
Yeah,
and that dynamic, I think, is at play on both the right and the left. Right? It's rare that you would find, for example, a Bernie Sanders supporter among young people that wouldn't have objections to the way that Netanyahu has behaved during the Gaza conflict and in response to October 7th. And similarly on the right, there's very, very similar things going on. It's interesting. It takes a while for the activist wing of a party to exert itself politically fully. You mentioned Vietnam. Vietnam is an interesting example because in the Johnson administration, at the Democratic National Convention, which I believe was in Chicago that year, there was a bunch of anti-Vietnam protesters there. But at the time, Vietnam was still very, very strongly supported by the American public. And I actually am of the view that Vietnam was a much more justified war than the Iraq War was, actually, myself, because I believe in some of the principles of the Cold War. And there was videos where ABC News and CBS and those different media companies were capturing where Chicago police were clubbing, in some cases unconscious, and arresting these anti-war protesters trying to disrupt the Democratic National Convention and saying, hey, Lyndon Johnson is in favor of war. And there was a flash poll run, I think it was by ABC immediately afterwards, and they discovered that the American public, far from having the sympathy for the protesters, actually was sympathetic to the police. So it took a long while before the sort of anti-Vietnam War wing took hold of the Democratic Party, and I don't think that really was very, very manifested until like maybe the mid-'70s. So it was quite a gap, 10 or 15 years, and so I don't think it's going to be instantaneous.
James, I've been struck by, I've visited a number of groups now within the Muslim community here in Dallas, and I've been struck by just how many Muslims are now pretty sympathetic, I would say, or at least acknowledging the right's position on Gaza. Who would have thought that Marjorie Taylor Greene would have called this a genocide, and Bernie Sanders refuses to call it a genocide. And so there is a realignment, maybe not a philosophical realignment, but certainly an acknowledgement that on the right, there's a morality there. And that morality, I think, extends beyond actually Gaza. It extends to a lot of social touchstone issues that I think have impacted Muslim communities, especially those in blue states, for a few years now, actually. In Michigan, there were demonstrations over school curriculums and other parts of the country. So I think there is this broad, maybe a realignment. Post 9/11, Muslims in America very much lurched to the left, and and sought sanctuary within progressives. And I think that's shifting. However, I was speaking to an imam yesterday, a very popular imam in the local community, and his point, he acknowledged all of what I've just said there, but he also said, but there is a deep Islamophobia within the right, and that's why we've got to be extremely careful in terms of how we align ourselves, if we are going to align ourselves with the right. Like how would you wrestle with these, with what's happened, what I think from the outside, at least what I observe within the Muslim community?
So it's interesting. We had a very interesting situation here in Irving, where there was, and this is where my friendships in the Muslim community started. We had Miriam Adelson, who is a very big donor and very convicted on the Zionist, cause. Decided she wanted to build the world's largest casino here in Irving,
Right.
and it's very interesting. She initially, or I don't want to say she, I mean the company. She runs a company called Las Vegas Sands Corporation. But the Las Vegas Sands Corporation initially wanted to do this really, really quietly and draw minimal attention from the public and from the media. And there was some good opportunities where one of the probably the most conservative councilman on the council, who's a friend of mine named Luis Canosa, he ended up speaking out and saying, hey, I think that this casino could lead to, an issue of predatory gambling here in Irving. And at the time, if you look at the map of Irving, like most of the Muslim community is in, two of the 6 districts, the north and the far west, and by their biggest mosques. And those they were not initially aware of what was going on, and so there began to be like an effort on the part of they were wanting to build this world's largest casino with right by the University of Dallas, which is a very prestigious conservative Catholic university that I'm an alumnus of. And a lot of the alumni of the University of Dallas, and eventually formally the University of Dallas itself, said, hey, we can't have the world's largest, or we don't have assurances that the associated crime and other issues associated with casinos in typical studies, wouldn't threaten the safety of our female students and other things of that kind. And so the university sort of kind of woke up first, and then gradually, like, we began to dialogue more with the Muslim community and kind of bring them more and more into the effort to sort of oppose this. The Las Vegas Sands Corporation, in a public press conference, they promised that they wouldn't put any money into Irving municipal elections. Irving still has a small town feel, even though it's kind of a big city. It's 250,000, over 250,000. But suddenly they use this sort of shell 501c4 dark money organization to dump a bunch of money in. And a lot of the citizens of Irving kind of woke up and became really, really concerned about this issue. And it became a really big rallying point where a lot of relationships were forged, in particular between the Catholics who were concerned about, the University of Dallas, and the Muslims who have religious reasons for opposing casino gambling in a way that Catholics don't. Catholics don't have like a religious prohibition on casino gambling in that way. But that was a really amazing laboratory experience where people, were talking, and there was conversations and, about, conservative Catholics, helping, even do Gaza resolutions, and those conversations, there's always a ways to go, because I think that this is a movement that's growing, and that's going to continue to be more and more commonality. One of the things that we align on, in addition to casinos, is the whole issue most of the Irving Muslim community is very against sort of the more aggressive forms of the LGBT movement, and there has been a lot of inroads made in Irving over the last 5 or 6 years, just in terms of like putting, you know, more propaganda out there in that regard. And one of the things that had happened that was really upsetting to the Muslim community is that during Ramadan, I guess the library director decided to put out a book about how it was like my Ramadan, coming out or something. I forget what it was called, but something like that, where it was like, it was kind of trying to appeal to the Muslim community about, hey, this is something that we should foster and encourage. And a lot of the parents were very upset about it, and they expressed opposition. And it was something that we had also been against, not just LGBT, but any sort of pornographic materials. And so the pushback has been, strongly an aligned issue for us. And so there's a lot of ways in which that we can work together. Mm-hmm. One thing that I hesitate about, I don't like discrimination against Muslims. And there's actually been interesting examples of discriminations against Muslims in Texas, and in particular in Irving, which I'd love to explain to you.
Please.
So I mentioned that okay, this is a little gets into the weeds a little bit. Mm-hmm. So there's so Miriam Adelson, the large Zionist donor that I mentioned, she has been trying to push the legalization of casino gambling in Texas, in addition to trying to get a site, approved in Irving. And so her order of operations for it was going to be, she was going to try to get a zoning approval for a casino in Irving, conditional on Texas approving it at the state level. Then she was going to sort of have her army of lobbyists that she had hired go to the Texas legislature and say, hey, we've got polling. The majority of Texans want casino gambling. The city of Irving wants the world's largest casino right here in Irving. Mm. And, there's really no reason for you guys to serve as roadblocks to the desire of the people to bring casino gambling into Texas. And she had thrown a lot of money into the process. But one of the things that, she had given money to, for example, a congressman, a lot of money to a congressman by the name of Jeff Leach. And she had, there had been sort of this whole question of the Epic Mosque controversy, which was up in Plano, which is a little bit north of us down here in Irving. But there was, what happened was a bunch of people who she had very, very heavily funded began pushing this idea, Greg Abbott, among others, like pushing this idea that this was a sort of a backdoor to bringing Sharia law into Texas, because in particular, the mosque was going to be part of a housing complex, and that most of the marketing was geared towards marketing to Muslims. Now, I think what a lot of people who may not be Muslims that may view this and may not understand is that Muslims often go to the mosque 5 times a day to pray. And so proximity for a Muslim to the mosque is, from a religious perspective, religious freedom perspective, is much more important than Catholics, because like I typically would not visit a church more than twice a day, and that would be unusually high for a Catholic's frequency of going into a specific church. And so Muslims tend to want to congregate pretty strongly around the mosque, so they can maybe be within walking distance and things like that, to do the 5 prayers a day and things like that. And so that sort of exaggerated like Islamophobia issue kind of cropped up right after a bunch of Muslims had shown up and started speaking against the world's largest casino at City Hall.
So
and
there
it was
a
all
connection.
It's not provable, but what I will say is that the donations from Miriam Adelson flowed into most strongly the politicians who were pushing for this, and suddenly they were talking about the Epic Mosque in Plano, and that seemed potentially unrelated to Irving. But then there's a group which is called Resistance Against Islamic Radicals Foundation LLC. So it's called Foundation, but it actually is an LLC registered in Delaware. So it has, I guess, a for-profit business model, I guess, even though it's called a foundation. And the foundation, right after that, sent a reporter or whatever they call it into West Irving, around one of the bigger mosques, which is on, I don't want to bore your British audience, but it's in West Irving.
Yeah.
And they went in and they had gone through and they were like, oh, look, like there's all these Muslims living here. There's these women walking around in hijabs and blah, blah. This is clear that this is Sharia law has come to West Irving also, in addition to Plano. And it's interesting. The day after the Resistance Against Islamic Radicals Foundation LLC published this story, as it was called, on its website. Oh yeah, and the evidence that they gave that Sharia law was there was kind of funny. That there were Muslim street names. So like Kwasmari Boulevard, and they're like, oh look, see, there's Muslim street names, and then the parks that they went to video had no dog signs. Now there's no dog signs in many parks, and obviously Muslims, as you know, like they don't have as many dogs as Christians. That's something that I don't have to explain to you, but dogs are not as much a part of Muslim culture, to put it very mildly. And so they're like, okay, there's no dog signs in the park. There's Kwasmari Boulevard, and these people are all living in this complex that's right around the mosque, and they are all wearing hijabs and stuff. So like clearly, like Sharia law has come to Irving, and I'm just like, are you serious? And to me, it's interesting because some of the activists who had been most vocal against the casino project in Irving started to get pressure from more cautious elements in the Muslim leadership world that were like, hey, we're going to get retaliated against if we don't stop speaking out against this casino. And there's a handful of community or housing associations that shared a property management company. This sort of property management company is the kind that would just like do the lawns, like plant the bushes and water everything and all that kind of stuff. And the day after this report came out, they sent a letter to all 7 of the Muslim majority communities saying that they were discontinuing services, which they had had for 10 or 15 years. I have actually been advocating inside the Muslim community that this is something that they should take legal action against. And my understanding from consulting with some of my friends who are attorneys is that there's very clear issues with violating the religious discrimination rules in this issue, in what's called fair housing law. And so it's a very, very winnable case. Probably, I'm not an attorney, so please don't take that to the courtroom. But it's apparently a very, very winnable case where you could set a precedent that like you can't discriminate against someone because the names are Kwasmari Boulevard, the women are wearing hijabs, and there's no dogs in some of the parks. And so but in that community, in those neighborhood associations, several of the folks, and I don't mean to criticize anyone, I don't even know their names, but some of the folks who are more cautious think that they shouldn't bring litigation because they're afraid that they'll draw the eye of Sauron more on the Muslim community, if they sue to vindicate their rights. And that sort of question it gets to the heart of where we can work together, because we have people in the Catholic world that know their way around the courts, that know these legal issues, and there's so much opportunity for collaboration. But there is, I think the fear that the right is Islamophobic is probably part of the caution on the Muslim side.
For sure.
And that I think that it's one of these things where if this fear is allowed to germinate undealt with, then there's not going to be a real alignment that there could be. One other thing I want to say about the term Islamophobia, and one of the things I don't like about the term, even though I agree that they're just like I described, is anti-Muslim discrimination.
Sure.
I prefer that term. But the thing I don't like about Islamophobia is because I'm Catholic, you're Muslim. I hope and pray that you will become Catholic tomorrow. And I expect, if you're a good Muslim, that you would want me to, recite, to become Muslim,
Inshallah.
And so one thing I don't like about the term Islamophobia is it doesn't make a distinction between religious zeal and sort of a political attitude. And that I think, is something. The term Islamophobia is never going to be something that's very frequently discussed on the right, because the term is, it has too much potential
loaded.
baggage.
Yeah. No, I accept that. And I think there is a feeling. I spoke to some people who were involved with these common conversations that you've been having and over the casino and the action you took. And I feel that there is certainly scope for an alignment there, and at least to have these continuous conversations. And I just think that fear exists, and possibly there are some on the progressive left who are stoking those fears to ensure that Muslim communities here do not see their lot in any other political party except for the Democrats. But I think there is a coming of age, it seems to me, of Muslims here in America, and they've realized that we need to do politics in a transactional way, and we need to think more deeply about how we're aligning ourselves as Muslim communities, and think about our long-term interests as Muslim communities here in America, as well as the interests of American foreign policy and how that should be pursued in Muslim countries, in places like Gaza. That's why I think it's a fascinating. I've come at a very fascinating time, I think, both on a domestic and international front. And from afar, at least, as a British Muslim, we almost came to the conclusion that the MAGA right or the Republican right is this Islamophobic or anti-Muslim contingent where there is just no way of rationally having relationships. And I think that I've been.
And now you're seeing the person who's most outspoken on the issue is Marjorie Taylor Greene of all.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
And no one's going to accuse her of being like a wishy-washy moderate.
Absolutely. I think Gaza has been a wake-up call, and I think what we've witnessed of Tucker Carlson, his most recent interviews, and Candace Owen, I think has been extraordinary, really. So there is an interesting development here, and I would like to follow it, I think, over these next few years. I suppose one last thing, maybe a question for you. I mean, one of the concerns, another concern that the Muslim community have here is that the original alignment to the left cost the Muslim community quite dearly, because that alignment led to an ideological commitment, especially amongst younger Muslims, that compromised, I think, our faith in so many ways. And I think there is that fear as well that that alignment with the right may create another series of unintended consequences. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, my view is that the biggest danger to the Muslim faith, not that I can be considered an authority on the topic, would be the sort of indifferentism that's poisonous to all religions. And so if Muslims are dealing with authentic Catholics or Protestants or whatever, like evangelicals, whatever it might be, like who would be eager to see them baptized, but are happy to work with them politically, then there's a faith authenticity that you're dealing with. Whereas, it's interesting because I associate somewhat with with some of the folks who have been activists on the question of Gaza, particularly Dr. Bilal Paracha, and he's a big leader in this community here on that issue. And it's interesting. Now he's building a coalition that's very focused on Gaza, and it makes sense that he is going to try to cast the widest possible net to bring in as many people. But I'm definitely seeing, when there was a meeting, there was a really intense conversation that I was surprised some of the younger Muslims were taking any position opposed to me. They said, hey, if we want to build a larger movement, where do values come in? Things like, the stance of, both Christianity and Islam on homosexuality and other shared stances. Now, the Catholic Church, is even more morally conservative on sexual issues than the Muslim religion. But in general, there's kind of a strong alignment on questions of value and, raising people as well as possible in an ideal situation of having a loving father and mother. Obviously there's people that can't be in that situation for reasons through no fault of their own. Mm-hmm. No one's condemning them, but that sort of values alignment, some of the Muslims were like, this is really important. This needs to be part of any sort of big tent thing. And I said, if you guys take out this values piece, then you can just be associated with just the liberal activists. And there were people in some of these conversations that were atheistic, Marxist, people that are stalwarts of the left, who I would have very, very little in common with, other than perhaps a few foreign policy things. And I think it's very important for Muslims to beware of the secularizing influence of indifferentism. And as long as Islamophobia is thought of as, if someone wants to convert me, they're Islamophobic, then we can't have any alignment.
I've never heard a Muslim who believes who doesn't believe in.
It's probably to be honest, I'm saying the way that conservatives hear the word Islamophobia. Yeah. When we hear the word Islamophobia, we hear, oh, this is an anti-evangelism potential term, and that's one thing that I hesitate about the term. Anti-Muslim discrimination to me is much clearer and just so much less baggage, as I said before. But but anyway, that's kind of my view on that. Since I've become friends with Muslims, two of the things that I'm particularly impressed by, one was I became friends with Muslims during Ramadan, and it's interesting. I'm a history nerd, and so I've even read some of the early encounters between the Franks and the Muslims in the wars in Spain and France, in the 9th century, and so 8th and 9th centuries, and so forth. And back in the day, Catholics used to have a very strict observance of Lent, and what we used to have is we'd have 40 days where you would only eat one vegan meal after dark. Mm-hmm. And they used to say, oh, look, the Muslims only do 30 days, and they're allowed to eat meat during Ramadan. This is soft fasting, and and now Catholics don't even come close to the Muslim standards on fasting, and so that's actually been really inspiring to me to try to take my faith on fasting more seriously. And as I mentioned earlier, the question of usury, it's interesting. The modern West has this huge problem. It's creating massive discontent on both the left and the right, with these kids graduating $120,000 in student loan debt, just basically slaves, and to their debts. And those teachings, there were some disagreements between Aquinas and Averroes, back in the day, on what exactly was illicit interest. Aquinas, for example, would be okay with something like bonds and something like mortgages that are fully collateralized. I don't want to go too far into the weeds on that, but Whereas Averroes said no interest, never.
Mm.
But Aquinas and Averroes are much closer than Aquinas and the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. You know what I mean? So I've admired that the Muslims have actually held closer on that. It's interesting. There's a nonprofit that I was recently looking up that's run by Muslims that does, I think it's called the Infinite Education Program or something. And they make interest-free loans to Muslims seeking to go to college.
Oh, yes.
And that's all based on, of course, the usury teaching. They're trying to make that doable for their own people. Yeah. And it's interesting. Jews actually do something similar. They have what's called Hebrew Free Loan Association of Dallas. There's one in Fort Worth, and they do the same thing for Jews. It's interesting. Catholics haven't actually been as disciplined about putting that into force. And so those are two things where I feel like discovering what Muslims are doing now is allowing me to more authentically go deeper in my own faith and be like, well, why haven't there been really strong nonprofits set up to allow Catholics to get a college education without going into debt that charges interest? You know what I mean?
James Bell, it's really been a fascinating conversation today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.